what would ever make anybody think that mixing fire and water would create something so strong and so powerful as a steam engine? There is no other machine that combines all three of those elements: earth, which would be coal, fire, water, that normally in all aspects and in all conditions oppose each other. And I don't think that there's ever been a day that I haven't climbed up in this cab and been totally amazed at why this thing works. Why do these side rods go round and round and they never come off? Every day you look at it and you walk away scratching your head thinking, why does this work? Why doesn't it just come apart?
Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam, powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious dreams, rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. It was built in 1907 in a factory back east, a symbol of this growing land, this 100-ton beast. It headed west, working hard, pulling its share of weight, hauling sheep and cattle, dry goods and other freight. Worked many years in Utah in the sun, snow, sleet, and rain, till the hand of progress slapped it down, the birth of the diesel train. About to meet its fate in a hole dug in the ground, till someone said, hey, hold on there, that engine's fever bound. Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam, powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious dreams, rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. No small task to keep this train rolling and on track. There are those folks who cannot see the value of looking back. The Heber Valley Railroad is determined to live on, and the lonesome whistle echoes forth in the Heber Valley dawn. Those who say there is no point in calling up the past, what's gone before sets the stage on how the future is cast. See the faces of the children as the 618 goes by. Wonder and amazement are reflected in their eyes. Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam, powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious dreams, rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. Rolling into history. Engine 618.
The steam locomotive still amazes. It was the height of technology in its time, the century from 1850 to 1950. The trains that steam engines pulled were highly anticipated. The cry of the whistle alerted communities that people and freight from far-off places were arriving. It was the steam engine that first gave Americans the feeling that their nation was shrinking and that the future was full of promise. After spending some time with Engine 618, you'll come to think of her as an old friend. You'll get to know her through the insights of her family, members of the engine crew at the Heber Valley Railroad. Along the way, we'll unearth some interesting bits of history, and then move on to the basics of steam operations to get you prepared for a driving lesson up in the cab. First, let's hear about life when steam was king, starting with Steve Carr, historian and part-time conductor for the Heber Valley Railroad.
Back in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, railroad fever spread throughout the whole western United States as villages and territories were opened up. The Transcontinental came through in 1869, and then the line from Ogden to Salt Lake down to Provo in 1871 and 1872. The railroads were how the land was opened up west of the Mississippi in large part. People began to depend on the railroad for commodities, for transportation, for bringing friends and family from the distant Far East and so forth. Between 1920 and 1940, there were more rail miles in the United States than before or since. And that's what is generally referred to as the golden era of the railroads, when automobiles were in existence, but they were inefficient and you couldn't depend on them, and yet the train was already there. Sometimes it might be late, but it was always running. Severe storms that would close highways and shut farms down generally would not have that great of an effect on the railroads.
People are fascinated by steam locomotives. They symbolize what America was a generation ago. It was held together, the United States were held together by ribbons of steel. It was before the interstate highway system was developed. It was before the internal combustion engine really came into its own. It also represents the Industrial Revolution. These locomotives were built with relatively loose tolerances, but they were large pieces. They were large castings and forgings, and a lot of the major technology that was put together in terms of metallurgy, in terms of machining practices and foundry practices, most of those were developed in conjunction with manufacture of steam locomotives. They represented an era when people would go to work for a company for life, and they would have their sons follow them and their grandsons follow them into that same occupation. The railroads were a very tightly knit family.
And the engine crews were heroes. They were national heroes. They carried the goods from one place to another. They helped support the war. They did all these things.
I have a tremendous respect for the people that designed these, built them, maintained them, operated them, because they were hard. It was darn hard work, the conditions they worked in, but they did wonders. I mean, these locomotives are just a wonder. It's an art, it's a skill, and it's long gone. In the old days, the railroad says our maintenance, we're going to do it ourselves, and so we're going to maintain a way of life. And basically, what they did is they created their own society. They had railroad towns: Evanston, Wyoming, Ogden, Utah, Green River, Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Milford, Utah. These were all railroad towns. They built their shop complexes. They had a whole society in all these towns.
The web of railroad towns catered to the needs of the old iron horse. An engine like 618 can't travel further than about 100 miles on a supply of coal and water. It has to be fed, watered, and cared for at intervals along the rail line. A steam locomotive requires special attention just because of its engine type.
A steam locomotive is known as a external combustion engine, they nickname it, whereas a diesel is an internal combustion. And with an external combustion engine, your lubrication requirements are far different than, say, an automobile or a car or a diesel motor, because all your oil is exposed to the outside and you're constantly having to renew that. So that requires a locomotive has to stop and be lubricated. It is more of a human need for locomotive maintenance.
The railroads became a folklore item of American history that just everybody became imbued with. The era of steam railroading was kind of a simple part of America back when the world was young. Things were not as hectic, and it seemed like people had more time to put into things.
There were no cell phones. There were no pagers. There were no highways. A car was something you used in town. And the excitement in life was getting on the train and going somewhere. And the big steam locomotive up in front.
It takes you back to when life was a little simpler, a little quieter, more relaxed. I guess it's the closest thing to a time machine that you get.
What is remarkable is that steam locomotives were in operation on a lot of railroads clear through the 1950s. And that was after the automobiles and trucks had been very well developed. But at the same time, auto manufacturers and the locomotive manufacturers hadn't come up with something that could equal the power of the steam locomotive for pulling sheer weight.
Both Engine 618 and its railway through Utah's Heber Valley are typical of the golden age of rural railroads, a slice of Americana which has mostly disappeared. The Heber Valley Railroad runs like a typical short line railway, operating from 1920 to 1950. And 618 is a style of steam locomotive that operated on almost every railway in the United States. Now let's spend a few minutes getting to know Engine 618. This steamer was born in 1907, built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for the Oregon Short Line, a part of the Union Pacific Railroad. 618 is a hand-fired, coal-burning steam locomotive, meaning that all of its fuel must be shoveled by hand into the firebox. The essential coal and water for operating the engine are contained in a tender car that follows right behind it. The tender holds 16 tons of coal. About 2 tons are consumed on a 32-mile round trip. The tender also holds 9,000 gallons of water, and a third of that, 3,000 gallons, are used on a 32-mile round trip. It takes 9 hours to transform her lifeless boiler into a steaming behemoth. She measures 16 feet high and weighs almost 213,000 pounds. That's over 105 tons, and that doesn't include the weight of the tender. Engine 618 moves at speeds from 10 to 18 miles per hour, but often travels slower because of the sharp curves and steep grades on the canyon leg of its route. Engine 618 sports a 280 wheel configuration. Engineer John Ramash explains.
Steam engines were classified according to their wheel arrangement, and it wasn't the total number of wheels on the locomotive, which would include the tender and the engine itself. It was just the locomotive, the boiler and the frame. And a 280 means that you've got 2 front drive wheels, 8 driving wheels, or 8 power wheels, and 0 or no trailing wheels. So there's no wheel that supports the back end of the engine. So this particular locomotive is known in railroad terms as a 280, which is also known as a consolidation type locomotive. So any steam engine that's got a 280 wheel arrangement can be called a consolidation. This engine is a C57, and the C stands for consolidation. 57 stands for 57-inch drive wheels. So when the railroad people would look at this engine and it would be brought into the shop foreman would say, I need you to work on that C57. And the shop mechanic automatically figured that he was going to go work on a consolidation type locomotive in the shop, and it had 57-inch drivers.
But the 280 was really the workhorse of American railroads. The big railroads used them on mainline operations as well as on short lines, and the short line railroads relied on them because of their relatively small, compact size and their great strength. They were used mostly in freight, and they were designed to haul 50 or 60 40-foot freight cars on the level track. In fact, the last time I saw an operating steam engine in Utah was between Salt Lake and Ogden, and it was a 280 engine that was pulling this freight train down to Salt Lake.
The 618 is one that is a very powerful engine, and it is a very dependable locomotive, but if you don't know what you're doing, it will put you in your place. I think the hallmark of the 618 is its sheer reliability. The thing has been, I've rarely seen it where it could not make the trip. That engine has always brought her train home.
Engine 618 can be considered a typical machine of its time. Nothing special back in the early decades of the 20th century, but it was upgraded when it was acquired by the Union Pacific Railroad.
the Oregon Short Line was bought by the Union Pacific Railroad, and the Union Pacific Railroad was very adamant in their design and construction of steam locomotives. And Union Pacific would go to the builder and say, this is how you will build our locomotive. And the builder would say, well, no, that's not how we build them. And Union Pacific would say, we're buying the locomotive, you will build it our way. And that's why this engine started to change in the 30s and 40s and 50s, because Union Pacific came back and said, this might be fine for that railroad, but this engine is now ours and it will be changed and it will be upgraded. And this engine is much more powerful. It's a far better engine now than it was when it was originally built. And that's simply because of the philosophies that Union Pacific had in their steam power and the way that they designed and built their steam locomotives.
It was thoroughly, and I mean thoroughly, rebuilt in 1941 at Pocatello, Idaho by the Union Pacific, because they knew they had to keep it for a long time. And so they really rebuilt the thing. And that paid off and is paying off now for us to be able to keep it, because I've seen other locomotives that haven't had that last repair, and they were pretty worn out here.
The career of Engine 618 began with 50 years of pulling freight trains in northern Utah and southern Idaho.
It operated most of the time in northern Utah. It was based out of Ogden and ran up to Malad and occasionally to Pocatello and over to Logan and Preston.
618 worked as a freight engine in Utah and Idaho from about 1907 until the late 1950s. The rise of diesel-electric technology eventually brought on the decline of steam power.
They had a cutoff date back in the late 30s, and that's when they said the technology for steam is through. And that was in the United States. They said, we're not going to develop it anymore. That was about 1939. After the war, dieselization just went really fast.
The diesel-electric propulsion was much cleaner than steam, of course, and actually somewhat less expensive. And so by the time the railroads were dieselizing, largely in the 1950s, hundreds and thousands of steam engines were then being sent to the scrap yards and being cut up, so that by 1955 there were very few steam locomotives left, and most of them were in museums.
Engine 618 was retired in 1958, shortly after it received some special attention.
The railroad overhauled this engine in 1957, anticipating that it would run for some time later, and then suddenly decided to retire it.
Union Pacific donated Engine 618 to the state of Utah, with stipulations that it not be sold, scrapped, or given to an out-of-state railroad. In late May of 1958, it was fired up for what was thought to be the last time, and under its own power pulled into the diesel complex in Salt Lake City. Later, the lifeless engine was pushed across North Temple Street in Salt Lake City and into the state fairgrounds by one of its successors, a diesel-electric locomotive.
When I was probably about 7 years old, one day we were waiting for the salt air train at the depot on North Temple in Salt Lake, and we noticed the track was extended across the street, which was rather odd because tracks normally didn't run across the street. We saw a steam engine sitting on the end of the track inside the fairgrounds. So we walked over while the train was still coming and decided to take a look at the steam engine, and that's where it turned out to be the 618, and they had just donated it to the state of Utah for permanent residence and display at the fairgrounds. And that's when I first encountered it, and all through the years, since I lived in the area, I would visit it, jump the fence, and just let the imagination run wild. I remember looking at all the controls on the locomotive and looking down to the boiler and everything, and trying to imagine what it was really like, because all I ever heard as a young boy was all the stories from my uncles and my grandparents who worked on the railroads, and they'd talk about all the railroad stories, and that's all I wanted to do. That's all I wanted to be, was an engineer. But over the years, you could tell parts were disappearing and everything was starting to rust out, and it was looking quite grim.
And it stayed there, you might say, gathering rust and becoming a conversation piece, but after a while it began to be a bit of an eyesore. However, according to some of the stipulations of the Union Pacific giving that engine, they couldn't very well do anything else with it. And so there was a thought of digging a big hole right next to it and then tumbling it into the hole, because nobody knew what else to do with it and nobody was interested in it.
But instead of burying the old Iron Horse where she had rested for nearly 12 years, Engine 618 was rescued by the promise of heading up a new tourist railroad based in Heber City. It was rebirth from an almost certain death.
We knew that that engine was available, and we knew that it had been outshopped and overhauled just shortly before it had been placed in retirement.
And the 618 was the first engine to be taken out of a city park and restored and put back into operation. So it's unique that way.
And so it was just a matter of putting some gauges back on, doing some piping, a little bit of repair work, and then being able to put compressed air into the cylinders as if it were steam, and having the engine operate on its own out of the fairgrounds.
Through the autumn months of 1970, Engine 618 began a long, slow journey back into service. Volunteers moved her gradually out of the fairgrounds with the aid of temporary track and compressed air for her cylinders. Her 3-block path to the main line took 2 months to complete. Then, after a tow south to the mouth of Provo Canyon, Engine 618 was tested and fired back to life after a 12-year sleep. In early December of 1970, she began an arduous 2-day journey up Provo Canyon to Heber City, under her own power. She pulled 4 passenger cars and a caboose, all headed for the new operation. The tracks had been unused for nearly 3 years, so volunteers worked to clear the rail line. Engine 618 was making history as the first steam locomotive in the United States to be removed from display and placed back into service pulling trains. Before you join one of our engineers in the cab for some work in the yard, you'll need to know about the responsibilities of the engine crew and understand how steam power works. Let's start with engineer Ken McConnell and his story of how he got started in steam railroading.
I wanted to be able to run a massive machine like this, just to see if I could do it. My first experience with a steam engine was when I took a trip down to the canyon as a passenger. And I got off at the stop and I went up to the engineer there and I said, I want to learn to drive one of these things. And he sort of chuckled and said, well, you got to start as a fireman first. And so I said, I'll be willing to do that. So I worked as a fireman for a couple of years and then moved into the engineer seat.
Most people say, well, the glory of the job is in the engineer. And your engineer is only as good as your fireman. The fireman is the key to the whole combination. You don't have a good engineer if you don't have a good fireman. And I wish that I could instill in all of our firemen the importance of their job and let them know that it doesn't take sitting on the right side of the cab in the engineer's seat to be the real hero. You were part of a team. What matters is doing the best you can do at whatever side of the cab you're sitting on.
And a good fireman is the one where you look across the cab and you see him sitting down cleaning his fingernails or something. The best firemen are the ones that work the least. What you have when you're firing a steam locomotive is what's called the combustion triangle. You have your heat, your fuel, and your oxygen. And if you can get a good balance of that, you'll get good combustion. You have to keep the air moving through the fire. And what happens is if you throw too much green coal or too much unburned coal into one spot and the air can't get to it and you can't get that good conversion to get the maximum amount of heat at the time that the carbon is released, you'll get a lot of smoke. And so a sign of a good fireman is one who understands that combustion triangle. When everything is going well and you're working the engine hard up the mountain grade, for example, you won't see very much smoke. As you're backing down drifting and there's not a lot of draft coming through the engine, the sign of a really good fireman is one who can keep the smoke down to a minimum level. And so a good fireman is one who tries to keep things consistent. Well, a good engineer has to be able to use all of his senses. With an engine, for example, you can tell that the brakes are sitting up by smell. You've got to be able to listen very closely, know what you're listening for, to make sure that the stroke is set properly on the engine, to make sure you're not working the engine against itself, or to make sure that it's not lame. These locomotives have very little in the way of instrumentation. A lot of it is a sense of feel. It's something that comes a lot with experience as you learn the profile of the railroad line. For example, you know where the little hills are, where the sags are, where you need to set a little bit of air brakes to keep the train stretched out, to give it a good ride, or you'll know where the train's going to start to run on you and pick up speed versus where it's going to start to slow down and stall on you. So it's something that takes a lot of practice to build that finesse. And the biggest thing is to be easy on the engine. Some people just have a natural feel for mechanical things. They can work together with an engine.
With the 618, when the first time I was assigned as engineer on it, you'd grab the throttle and the engine just pulsated, and you could feel the life. And it was cooperating with you, and it was, you worked together. You didn't just tell it what to do. You tried to feel. And it can be at times for me, it's always been quite emotional. You can actually form a bond with a piece of equipment. But the steam engines have a special one because they're so hostile of an environment anyway, working around them. And they're dirty and they're hot and everything else, but they also, it's something that it's like they love you back. And you feel that, and you kind of can get into a groove with them. And that's what keeps me going, is that emotional bond.
The reason I see the steam engine as being a living, breathing thing is because it has so many different aspects and so many different sides to it. You've got all of your appliances, and you balance everything that's going on. You've got your fire and your water and your steam pressure, and you're listening to the way that the machine works. And it's an interesting experience to sit up here in the cab of the steam engine and listen and see and feel all of those things happening at once. And most people think that the engineer sits up there and drives the train. Well, the truth of the matter is, you get the train going, and then the engine takes over, and you're just there as a spectator. You're riding along. You're there for the enjoyment of it. And it's when you get that feeling that you sit back and it really hits you that this thing is living, it's breathing, it's doing everything it needs to do almost on its own. You feel the engine, you don't run it. And you are an observer and a spectator in the engine. You're not the controlling factor of the engine. And when you realize that you're just a part of the team, you're a player, and watch it get into its groove and then just go with it, that's when you create a good engineer.
You have to be very sensitive to the response of the locomotive, because the locomotive will reflect, in my opinion, your mood. And if you have a bad karma day or whatever, it'll return it to you. If it gets in a bad mood, it isn't very often. But when it does, then you have to work with it and try to help it, or it'll absolutely refuse to operate. There's other days where the engine has a mind of its own, it seems like. It has its own feelings too. I can't describe it other than once you plug yourself into it, you forget about everything else, because it's you and that locomotive, and you're working together. It's not like any other kind of a concentration or doing a math project or anything else. It's trying to work together.
Before we climb up into the cab, Engineer Ken McConnell will give you the basics of steam operations.
This is the firebox right here. Pretty good size, and we burn coal in this machine. This is where we build the fire to boil the water to make the steam. And it's a hand-fired steam engine, so that means the fireman has to shovel quite a bit of coal during each trip. Coal boils the water. Inside we have about 250 tubes that the heat and gas go through, and it's surrounded by water, so that heats the water rather quickly. The steam goes up into the steam dome up at the top, and there is a throttle. When the engineer pulls the throttle on, sends the steam down to a manifold, and it's heated a second time, so it's a superheated engine. The steam comes down to this cylinder down here. This is a timing device. This tells the steam engine where to put the steam, into this end, or this end. It either pushes this way or pushes this way. And that forward and reverse lever is like a gear shift in that it allows either a lot of steam or a little bit of steam. If you're moving pretty good, you don't need a lot of steam to maintain your speed. But if you're starting out on a hill or putting a big load, you want all the steam you can get. When the steam is used up, it's exhausted back through and out through the stack. And that's where you get the chug, chug, chug of the steam engine. When this cylinder is filled with steam, and that drives this piston right here, and this is connected to the connecting rod. This connecting rod is attached to this wheel. These side rods here are connecting all of the wheels together so that we have 4 drivers on this side, 4 drivers on the other side. We have 2 pony trucks in the front. So this is called a 280. 2 pony trucks, 8 drivers, and no trailing trucks. If you ever talk to an old steam engineer and you say it's a 280, he'll know what you're talking about. We have to have air to operate the brake system. This is a steam-powered compressor. You might hear it thumping away here. It's kind of the heartbeat of the steam engine. This pumps air into this tank right here. We have another tank on the other side that holds the same amount of air. And this is where our braking system comes from. This is both the steam engine brakes and also the brakes on the train. The boiler holds 3,000 gallons of water. We have to replenish the water in the boiler from the tender back here. We have 9,000 gallons of water back here. And this device right here is called an injector. And this takes the water from the tender and forces it into the boiler when we need water. We'll open this up, it primes itself, and then it sends water into the boiler whenever we need it. One of the things you never want to do in a steam engine is run out of water. So it's pretty important to have this system working all the time. We have a backup system on the other side as well. The bunker up here is where the coal is housed. And the fireman shovels, it's not an auger system, it's a hand-fired steam engine. So the fireman has to shovel the coal into the firebox. It holds about 16 tons of coal. We'll use about 2 tons a trip. So we have to have a pretty healthy fireman. Why don't you climb on board and let's go for a ride. This is the brake for the train. If we're attached to a bunch of cars, this is what we stop the train with. If we're just running light engine with no cars attached, this is the engine brake right here. This is the throttle. This puts steam into the cylinders, and that's what makes it go. This is our forward and reverse lever. Pretty much speaks for itself. We have to keep an eye on our water levels, which we do over here on the water glass. This tells us how much water is in the boiler. Occasionally we'll have to do what's called a blowdown for the water glass. We open that up, clears the line, and it gives us a good shot of how much water we have in the boiler. And then we always have to keep our pressure up, and our pressure here, we try to run between 175 and 200 pounds. This is a sander. When we get onto the tracks and it's slick and our wheels start to slip, we put sand on the tracks, and that's what that gives us traction. This is a bell. And when we come into the station or there's people around, we have to give a warning. We turn the bell on. We're moving up to a couple onto another train. We've got to take the train back onto track number 2, get it ready for tomorrow's run. About 1 car length away from the train now. The conductor's signaling me to come ahead slowly. And he's asked me to stop. It's coupled. Now I need to back it up. Okay, now he's going to attach the air. We'll have to wait for a minute or 2 for it to pump up, and then we'll pull the train back onto track number 2. 3 whistles means we're moving backwards now. Giving it just a little bit of throttle. Coming up to a crossing, so we're going to have to signal the crossing. Move that ahead because it's kind of like a gear shift. We start out in low gear and move it ahead as we pick up a little speed. Kind of start with the brakes ahead of time because it takes a long time to stop the train. So I start slowing down early on.
Stop the train.
We're moving into the engine house now, putting the train away. I'm applying a little throttle right now. Going through the switch. Start the bell in just a minute for warning signals. And I've been given the stop sign for the conductor to change the switch so we can go into the engine house. Okay, we got the go-ahead sign, so we're going to go into the engine house now. Switches are in the right position. This is the brake, engine brake. Pretty sharp curve here, so we take it pretty slow. Just in case. Now, before we go into the engine house, I open up what's called the cylinder cocks. And that bleeds the steam off of the main cylinders and any water that's left in there. So you might hear the steam coming out of the cylinder cocks. Okay, we're going to go into the engine house now.
Now let's get out of the yard and join 618 on the railway.
We have a terrific variety of scenery. We have the Alpine Valley with all of its farms. We have the old look of the Old West with the sagebrush and the scrub oak and the mountainsides along the shore of Deer Creek Lake, or you can look to the other side of the train and see a beautiful recreation area with the lake. We also have the rugged beauty of Provo Canyon, where we're right next to the river. We have a lot of jagged rocks. We have beautiful vegetation and foliage down there. My favorite part of the line is down in the heart of the canyon, usually in early to mid-September. Beautiful down there. The colors are just fabulous, and it's very peaceful.
My favorite section is down in Provo Canyon, and it's a section of track that runs almost directly east and west. And on the south side of the train, there's a row of pine trees, and the river runs down through there. As scenery goes, and the aesthetic part of the railroad that's probably my favorite part of the railroad.
It's on a 4% grade. It's very challenging for the engineer. 4% grade is a very steep grade for a steam engine. With 600 tons of steel on a 4% grade, you can gather speed rather quickly. So it's critical that you understand your braking system and understand how much weight you're carrying and how fast you can go. And you have curves that you have to negotiate. Tremendous amount of responsibility. You've got 200 and 300 souls on board, and if you make a mistake, it could be costly. So it's quite a challenge taking that much weight into a canyon on 4%. 618 has got a very friendly personality. She enjoys working hard. If she's on a hill, she loves it, and you can feel it from the top to the bottom.
A lot of people will describe steam operations in the summer as being the dog days. It's very difficult to sit up here in a 130-degree cab when it's 100 degrees outside, and we wear the same thing year-round. You sit up there in the heat and you just wonder, why? This is crazy. We've got to drink 8,000 gallons of Gatorade to stay alive. You go home tired and beat, you're sore, it's always hot, but then you come back in the morning and you think, I do this because I love it. And then the fall comes along and the weather changes, and you get here and it's kind of cool, and you climb up in the cab and it's nice and toasty warm, and you get working, and it just, oh, it's great. The weather affects the personality of the steam engine because you've got different air conditions, you've got different wind conditions, the water's a little bit different, you've got different atmospheric pressures. All these things are part of the equation in making the steam engine run. And the fall lends itself to outstanding and very impressive steam operations. The engine seems to talk a little bit more. Its real personality comes out. It feels a little bit freer. And I will have to admit, honestly, that maybe it's us and not it that changes. That it's our idea that we're more comfortable with the fall than we are with the summer.
There's really no favorite, because I like the whole run. I just can't get bored. Even though at times I'll be in the engine, I don't look like I'm really doing anything, or I'm just so fixated on just sitting there. But I'm enjoying it. I mean, my thoughts, it's just, to me, it's almost a religious experience. I'm just taking it all in. I like it all.
Not only is the railway scenic, but it has a rich history that dates back to pre-Civil War times.
Jefferson Davis, as a government surveyor in the 1830s, was instrumental in surveying some of the routes for the original Transcontinental Railroad. At that time, clear back in the 30s and 40s, it was not known where the Transcontinental would run. And so that is an interesting aspect to find that this young contractor and surveyor actually was out here in Utah Territory even before the pioneers got here in 1849. It wasn't until the early 1860s, when the Confederate States seceded, that by that time he was a well-known Southern figure and became the president of the Confederate States of America.
Davis recommended the Provo Canyon route, although a more northerly path through Promontory, Utah was ultimately chosen for the Transcontinental Railroad. As rails spanned the country, Mormon settlements spread across northern Utah and into what would become the Heber Valley.
It wasn't until 1859 that much of the valley was settled, and it was largely settled by English converts to the Mormon Church. It was a farming community, and they named the original city Heber City after Heber C. Kimball, who was one of the early church leaders. By the 1880s, they began to feel left out because much of Utah's villages and cities and towns had rail connection. In 1889, the Rio Grande Western built from Provo up to Nuns Park at milepost 11. And then, for reasons that I'm not sure, they stopped construction. There was a little village there with a general store and a freight terminal that shifted freight from there up to Heber on the wagons. And for 10 years, it just stayed there.
Just before the turn of the century, in 1899, rails finally connected Heber City and Provo.
The people in Heber could go from Heber to Provo in a half a day and see their relatives or so forth, and then come back the next day, rather than taking 3 or 4 days on a freight wagon or even a buckboard. It was still quite a slow, tortuous ride up through Provo Canyon. People began to say that it just crept along, and so people then began to use the word Heber Creeper. And so the name of the Heber Creeper goes clear back to the 1890s and the early 1900s. There's a story about a young couple who got married down in Provo, and by the time the Heber Creeper, the slow-moving train, got into Heber City, they'd had their first baby. And of course, the main reason that railroads were built then, as they are used now, was for freight. Originally, the train ran every day, bringing commodities up, particularly fuel oil and coal and lumber and building products, because there was a lot of building going on in the turn of the century. Passenger traffic was somewhat secondary, and so they wound up putting a passenger car at the end of the freight train. And this is what we call a mixed train, a mixed freight and passenger operation. But it would run once a day. Occasionally there would be an extra freight train. They had a lot of hay operations up here and grain and sheep raising. So that by the 1930s, the Heber Valley and the subsequent areas shipped out more sheep than any other station on any other railroad in the country.
The rail line stayed busy through the decades until 1967, when the rails through Provo Canyon to Heber fell silent. A paved highway now linked the towns, and cars and trucks took over to move people and freight more quickly. But 3 years later, in 1970, Engine 618 was resurrected, and she pulled tourist trains on the railway for 20 years until the Heber Creeper went out of business in 1990. Heber's tourist railroad lives on today as the Heber Valley Railroad, which revived the operation with state assistance in 1992. In need of restoration, Engine 618 had to wait for completion of a new engine house. It had been nearly 50 years since a steam locomotive had been given a major overhaul in Utah. By 1995, after a 5-year rest, 618 was ready once again to welcome passengers.
It actually has been used more in the last 20 years than had probably been done in the previous 50 years. We anticipate that it will be used for many years to come.
A machine such as a steam engine is something that has a life of its own. Steam locomotive is very maintenance intensive, and we spend a lot of time doing odds and ends working on it.
We maintain the engine on a regular basis, so it's being renewed all the time. We can operate the steam engine at the same level as when it was first manufactured back in 1907. That's 200 pounds per square inch, so the boiler is in excellent shape. We were happy about that.
I don't necessarily see it as getting any older. The actual body of it and its lifespan is getting longer, but it's not wearing out. Today we can build parts for this engine that outlasted the original parts that were built for it, because we have alloy metals, we have composite materials, man-made materials, and I do not see any reason why this engine should ever be taken out of service and not used. It's very preservable, it can always be fixed, and as long as it's taken care of, and as long as we have engineers and crews that will feel the engine and get to know it and treat it correctly, there's no reason this engine can't last another 40, 50, 60, 100 years.
Train travel was a unique way to travel, and it was an elegant way to travel in years past, and we've lost that. To regain that at least once for memory's sake, I think everyone should at least take one train ride in their lifetime.
What I enjoy most about my job is seeing how people react to the steam locomotive, to the vintage railroad cars, to the beautiful scenic ride, and to see how they can relate and in a way step back into a time machine, because that's what this is. That's what really makes this job worthwhile, is allowing other people to step back into the past.
This is a legacy project of our history and our past, and it's something that we should treasure and keep here. Here they're living and breathing, and we want to maintain them and show what this thing was more than just a train going up and down the track. It was a way of life.
I get to recreate a time that we've all lost. And to watch it work and to really get into it and listen to it and feel it, it's an undescribable, unexplainable feeling. It really is just something that grabs you and captures you and really makes you wonder how it was created or why it was created and what makes it work and why it works. And just the whole combination is outstanding.
Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam. Powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious streams. Rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. It was built in 1907 in a factory back east. The symbol of this growing land, this 100-ton beast. It headed west, working hard, pulling its share of weight. Hauling sheep and cattle, dry goods and other freight. Worked many years in Utah in the sun, snow, sleet, and rain, till the hand of progress slapped it down, the birth of the diesel train. About to meet its fate in a hole dug in the ground, till someone said, hey, hold on there, that engine's fever bound. Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam. Powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious streams. Rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. No small task to keep this train rolling and on track. There are those folks who cannot see the value of looking back. The Heber Valley Railroad is determined to live on, and the lonesome whistle echoes forth in the Heber Valley dawn. Those who say there is no point in calling up the past, what's gone before sets the stage on how the future is cast. See the faces of the children as the 618 goes by. Wonder and amazement are reflected in their eyes. Engine 618, rolling down the track under its own steam. Powered by the earth, using water, coal, and air. Engine 618, loaded with a cargo of precious streams. Rolling into history, a treasure that's quite rare. Rolling into history. Engine 618.